Our second message of the day, you have been introduced to it already. Pastor Webb announced last night that what he'd be preaching on. He even gave us a little appetizer. And so we're tired of waiting. We'll have him to come and bring us the meal.
Well, good morning. Strap yourself in and let's get with it. We got a lot of ground to cover. The problem is now I have all this time on my hands to sit around and meditate and ruminate on this stuff. Been thinking about these things for years, and I'm trying to dump the whole load on you in two messages. But turn with me to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. As I said last evening, my title is How to Spot an Angel. I use that as just some catchy phrase to get your attention. I'm not going to be talking about how you can somehow see angels floating around up here in the sky above us. But I mean by this, how do we detect that angels have been involved in something, that they're present? How do we investigate or determine, diagnose that angels have been involved? We began to see last evening that the reason for bringing this up is because Paul, Stephen, the book of Hebrews, all point out that the law of Moses was given through the mediation of angels. God was speaking in angel mode to Israel. All right? Galatians 1. Let's just break in verse 6 and read about 3 verses here. Paul says, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there are some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. I think most of you were here last evening, so there's no need to really dwell on what we've already covered, but just to sum it all up, that what we saw in Hebrews chapter 2 is a contrast between two words from God, two messages. One, the word of angels, which is clearly, as you look at the rest of the book of Hebrews, it's talking about the law of Moses. And contrasting that word with the word of the Son, and they that heard him. And that is, of course, the revelation that we have in the New Testament. And just as the first chapter of Hebrews showed the supremacy of Christ, the Son, over angels, so that contrast carries over now the supremacy of the word of the Son to the word of angels. Okay? Paul, in our text, is astounded that the Galatian churches have so quickly fallen away from the gospel to another gospel, not really another, as he explains, there is only one. But then when he wants to play his trump card here, he says, though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you, curse them. Now, I've sort of always assumed that Paul is just using hyperbole here. You know, he's saying, well, it doesn't matter who comes, whether it's me or anybody else, Peter, John, I don't care who it is that comes to town. Even if I come back to town preaching another gospel, curse me. But could it be that Paul has another agenda here? As we see, the only other occurrence of the word angel in this little letter is where we are told that it was through the ministry of angels that the law was given. And when we understand the era here in the Galatian church is what? It's the Judaizing era of imposing circumcision. One of the elements, you remember we talked about the physical, visible things that were contained in the Mosaic system. There's one of these things. Circumcision was like a brand that marked the Jewish male as belonging to God. This is an outward physical mark that marked you as God's people. And so in imposing, and of course it stood for more than just circumcision, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It stood at, you remember in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, they're insisting that these Gentile believers be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. It's just, this is your initial act of sort of getting into that system, you see. It's the way the door gets open to the whole thing. And Paul recognizes immediately that though this seems like such a small thing, and surely can't you compromise on this? Let's just let these Gentiles get circumcised, and at least they can hobnob with the Jews. It's just a small compromise. So Paul immediately recognized this as utterly destructive of the gospel. And that those who perpetrated this stood under this anathema, this curse of which he speaks. We can well imagine that these Judaizers would say, well, our gospel, this hybrid gospel, is a more authoritative gospel than yours, Paul, because our gospel was given by the mediation of angels. And that would be a reason why Paul would make this statement, that it doesn't matter if it's an angel from heaven preaching this gospel. If it's not this gospel of grace, curse him. So I've already given you one clue. How do we spot an angelic gospel? Let me also go on to say, as I said last evening, the word angel, though we tend to use it in a very limited sense of these beings that are invisible spiritual beings, the word just is a job description. It's a messenger. And you have to determine from the context exactly what kind of messenger. Sometimes it's human messengers that are spoken of under this label. But I'm going to use the word today as we normally use it, as a created, intelligent, rational, moral, spiritual being, unseen, at least most of the time, to the human eye, belonging to another realm. Now, we live in an age of, and I was trained as a scientist, majored in math and physics, worked in a nuclear lab, that's my background. And unfortunately, now, being a minister of the gospel, I'm struck with the fact of how materialistic and rationalistic and anti-supernatural our present society and culture is. To understand what Paul is teaching in many of his letters, Galatians, Colossians, what the book of Hebrews is telling us, we've got to immerse ourselves in Paul's worldview. It is sometimes stated that though the Word of God is written for us, it wasn't written to us. You see the distinction? We say we believe in the historical grammatical interpretation of Scripture, right? What I'm insisting on is the historical side of this. What does it mean? It means what it meant to the people to whom it was spoken. It was not spoken to us in our 21st century culture. It was spoken to Paul in first century culture. And to understand it, you've got to immerse yourself in the cosmology of Paul. How did he view the world, the universe? What was his worldview? What was the paradigm in which he operated? And somehow we've got to grasp that. That's what we're wrestling with here. And we get clues. It's not that it's invisible. It's not that it's not being told to us. We just tend to gloss over these things. And again, read them as we would in the 21st century. But Paul had a very clear cosmology that involved an unseen world, another realm, that there's more to reality than what we can demonstrate by the scientific method. That's where we are today. The only reality that our culture today will admit, at least in higher circles, is what can be demonstrated by the scientific method. In other words, you can prove it, you can demonstrate it, it's reproducible, it's falsifiable, you've got ways of proving it works this way and not this way. In other words, all the principles of modern science, we say that's what reality means today. You and I are coming from a different viewpoint. We say reality involves more than the seen, natural, materialistic world, right? I mean, we're supernaturalists. To put it this way, we believe in the paranormal. Look up the word paranormal. It's that which cannot be scientifically demonstrated. That's what we're involved. That's what we're wrestling with. But we believe that. That was Paul's view of the universe, right? He clearly, as a Pharisee, and certainly he believed in the existence of angelic beings. And he employs that view as he teaches us of this. But again, under that umbrella of angels, we have a lot of different kinds, a lot of different functions, a lot of different creatures included under that label. For instance, we have those throne angels or beings, created beings, the seraphim, the cherubim, that seem to be attendants at the very throne of God Almighty. We find Paul talking about different kinds of powers, spiritual powers, rulers of wickedness, that kind of thing. We have in the book of Daniel mention of watchers. It's an Aramaic term that speaks of what we would call a guardian angel of some sort that's controlling. It was in the context of Nebuchadnezzar being put out to pasture, remember? The watchers are decreeing this. We have the usage of the word principality by Paul. It's the one that intrigues me because a principality implies the idea of a ruler over a given geographical region. And I think that's important to our understanding. Let me show you that from the book of Daniel. Go to Daniel 10 just a moment. And I'm hesitant to start roaming all over the Bible looking at these references. I'm going to have to trust you to fill in some of the blanks. I think most of you are Bible students to the where you can do that without us. I wish I had time to look at every reference, but here in Daniel chapter 10, Daniel is fasting and praying, and he's been 3 weeks, hadn't got an answer, and suddenly an angelic being shows up. I don't know how else to describe this being that comes and says, from the first day you started praying, I started coming to you. However, I was withheld. Notice in verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. You've been praying for 3 weeks. The prince of Persia has been withstanding me for 3 weeks. Now, who is this prince of Persia? Now remember, that's the empire. It's, if you look in chapter 10, verse 1, where are we in history? Well, Cyrus is the king of Persia. But it's clearly not a human prince that is being, the human prince is not somehow withholding this angel from showing up to Daniel. This is an angelic being of some sort, and he has dominion over Persia. And then notice at the end of this discussion, in verse 20, this same angelic being says, and then said he, knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? And now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia, and when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. If we think of those world empires, maybe we had Babylon first, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome. So this is the sequence of those kingdoms that Daniel has already seen in his visions. So I'm going to go back and fight some more with the prince of Persia, and then when that's over, I'm going to fight with the prince of Grecia. And he says, but I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that holdeth with me in these things, but Michael, your prince. Here we see another reference to an angelic being. Do you understand the angelic conflict that is going? And it's not seen by us. We're sort of in the position of Job. You realize Job never, ever realized what was really going on. That he was ground zero for a conflict that was happening in the heavens between God and Satan, and he never knew it. Never, ever knew it. We know the backstory, but he didn't know. We're sort of in that same boat. There's a lot of stuff going on in that unseen realm that is invisible to our eyes. But we know it's happening from texts like this. We also then began to realize that the Jews in the first century, in Paul's day, had an understanding of how the angels fit into the picture. First of all, there were holy angels, the elect angels, Peter calls them, and then there were fallen angels. Brother just quoted that passage of the hell prepared for whom? The devil and his angels. We see the same thing in Revelation chapter 12. After the Son is caught up to the throne of God, there's war in heaven, remember, between Michael and his angels and the devil, Satan, and his angels. And Satan and his angels are cast out to the earth. We have this same kind of understanding. Notice that there are unfallen angels and there are fallen angels. From that text where the dragon's tail sweeps a third of the stars of heaven to the earth, we're assuming that not a majority of the angels followed Satan, but a large number of angels have rebelled along with Satan. Now, putting our finger on exactly when that rebellion took place is a difficult thing. Sometimes we get the idea that, well, these angels, these unholy fallen angels, have always been that way, but the Scripture really doesn't tell us that. In fact, it sort of points us to another area. Can I have you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 32? I think this was an important text for the Jews of Paul's day. And unfortunately, there is a textual issue here that I will mention that I think tends to obscure the meaning of this. Deuteronomy 32, down in I start in verse 7. Deuteronomy 32, verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. Well, what we're talking about times a long time ago, basically. Well, what time are we talking about? When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. When God divvied out, we're familiar with Joshua and the Israelites conquering Canaan, and they divvying out the land, the inheritance, to the various tribes. But he's not talking about that. This is long before that. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance. When he separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. In other words, we're talking about God after the fall, after Babel, dividing the nations. You remember there were 70 descendants, and in Jewish thinking, you had 70 Gentile nations that came from those 70 descendants that are mentioned right after the Tower of Babel. And so God is divvying out to the nations their portion. And we see that happening in the wilderness wanderings. They go through the land of Edom, and God says, no, you can't have that land. I gave that land to Edom. They go over to Moab. Now, you can't have this land. I gave that to Moab. God has already divvied out this portion of land. Notice he divvies it out according to what says here, the number of the children of Israel, the children of Jacob. And what this introduces is an anachronism. This is long before Abraham, let alone Jacob and his children. And there is another variant. It's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's also found in the Jewish Septuagint that I think is the true reading here. That may disturb some of you, but I believe that. It is, he divvied it out according to the number of the sons of God. You familiar with that expression? We find it in the Old Testament to speak of this angelic council, the sons of God. We see them in Job, remember? The sons of God came before God's throne. We see it, the prophet Micaiah saw the heavens open and the sons of God around the throne, this heavenly council. And what it seems to indicate is that God has divvied out the Gentile nations to these angelic beings, that they have dominion over these principalities, these areas. But notice the next verse, verse 9, but the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. In other words, God reserved Israel unto himself. He gave the other nations over to angelic powers and angelic rule. Let that sink in a minute. Well, who then, where do these other nations get their gods? You ever thought about that? If you study anthropology, if you study the history of these ancient cultures, you find unanimity. I mean, I won't say without exception, but very rarely will you ever find an exception that they all speak with one voice. Where did you get your culture? Where did you get the understanding of your gods? And, well, the gods came down and gave it to us. What do you mean gods came down and taught you these things? Oh, they're not talking about extraterrestrials. They're talking about God's little g. They're talking about angelic beings who came and gave them their religion, their culture, their civilization. That's their voice. I mean, go study the subject. You'll find it all over the place, especially in the ancient Mesopotamian cultures, from your Ugaritic culture in Syria, Sumerian culture right there in the area where Abraham came from, where God called him out of that idolatry, the Akkadian culture north of there, and then later on the Assyrian and Babylon. They all say the same thing. Where'd you get your religion? Where'd you get your call? How do you learn? Where did you learn your speech and all that? We got it from the angels. The gods came down and gave it to us. Now, you can say, well, that's just mythology, and that possibly true, but it's interesting. It's sort of like the flood story, universal across the whole earth. What you're seeing here is the God's story, universal across the whole earth. All of these cultures are saying with one voice, that's where it came from. And this then helps explain the fact of what, well, Paul will say it in his Sermon upon Mars Hill, when he's talking about the Gentiles, their previous condition, the times of this ignorance, he says, God winked at. The word means literally he overlooked, he looked past you. His eyes were not on you. Where were they on? They were on his inheritance, Israel. In the past, God has overlooked you. He's given you up into the worship of these other gods and your idolatry. Now he commands all men everywhere to repent. We got a different situation at hand now that Christ has come, you see. But previously, the Gentile nations have been given into the hands of these, shall we say, angelic beings who rule over them. And so we see the situation. In Israel, we have a system of worship where they are under the administration of holy angels. The law is their schoolmaster, their guardian. Temporarily. No, it wasn't the eternal arrangement. Remember, Paul said it was added because of transgressions until the seed should come, to whom the promise was made. Notice the language of adding and until is, you know how our dispensational friends will talk about the church being a parenthesis, the church age. Well, there's a parenthesis, all right, but it's not the church. It's Israel. It's Israel under the law. That's the parenthesis. The law is added, given to Israel, becomes more or less their constitution, and it's going to last until the seed comes to whom the promise is made. So there's your parenthesis. It's a temporary system. It's temporal. It's not eternal. It came into being at a point in time. It's going to leave at a point in time. And it was given through the administration of angels. Okay? Are we clear on that? That's where we were last evening, so I'm having to repeat myself a little bit here. The Gentile world, on the other hand, is under an administration of fallen angels, if our understanding of Deuteronomy 32 is correct. That's what we're being told there. That's why you have the paganism out there in the Gentile world. All of these worships of all these various gods, these are really angelic beings masquerading as God. You do realize that, don't you? That's why Paul will say, I don't want you sitting in the idol's temple. Because when you offer sacrifices to that idol, who are you really offering sacrifices to? Demons. That's who's behind the worship of the Gentiles. And I don't want you converting with demons. I don't want you having fellowship with demons. In other words, let's understand the idol itself is nothing. In fact, the word pretty much means that. But there is something behind the idol. There is something that inspired that Gentile system, wherever you find it on the face of the earth. And it's not God and his holy angels, it's unholy fallen angels. And so at some point, these angels have rebelled against their God. That's clear. When exactly this took place, whether it's at Babel, whether it's at Genesis 6, there's a tricky one. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair and took of them wives and so forth. Speaking of a cohabitation of angels with human women, I know we have other explanations. I'm just saying in Paul's day, that was universally accepted that was angels mating with human women. You do have examples of angels showing up in human form, correct? The angels that came and ate with Abraham, two of them go and eat with Lot. Let me put it in a crude way. If they can feed, they can breed. And in Paul's day, that was universally accepted. I'm not saying it's so. I'm saying that's the way Jews thought. They got that from Enoch, the book of Enoch. Whether it's extra-canonical, I agree. It's not our authority. I'm simply saying that was the worldview in the day when the New Testament is being written. And it certainly seems to carry over to the biblical writers. Just look at 2 Peter, just look at Jude, where reference is made to those things. I realize that we've come up with other explanations that make it a little more palatable to our scientific age, but hey, if you're living in that day, that's the way they thought. In fact, if you ask a Jew, this is getting off my subject a little bit, if you ask a Jew where the demons come from, you know what their answer was? You remember the Nephilim that was born to this unholy union of angels and women, human women? They said when the Nephilim died, their spirits then become what we call demons. Interesting. They would have had an answer. That's what you would have heard if you asked a Jew in the first century where do demons come from. That was their answer. It was almost universally accepted among them that's the facts. And so you have out there in the Gentile world these gods, little g, masquerading as God, imposing a system of worship, an angelic system of worship on the Gentile nations. And you have over here in Israel holy angels imposing a system of worship. I use the word imposing because that's the term Hebrews 8 uses. These washings and divers things, all these types and shadows, they were imposed on them until the time of Reformation. They didn't have any choice. They were born under that system. So let's go to Galatians 4 a minute and see if we can go a little further with this. How exactly do angels then rule over either the Gentile world or over Israel, the holy angels? And let me use an analogy here of, if any of you have ever had horses. If you've had horses, you've had a horse escape. Just goes with the territory. And the question is, how do you catch a horse once he's got out of the pen, you know? Well, there's really two ways. Number one, you can get out there and just chase him and chase him and chase him until you finally catch him. It's not recommended. Good luck with that. The other way is to go get you a bucket of oats and stand out there and shake that bucket. And if he is within the hearing of those oats rattling around in that bucket, 9 times out of 10, he's going to walk right up to you because his nature loves oats. And you say, well, you mean you love oats? No. I don't have any use for oats, but the horse sure does. And so that's what I use to control the horse. What do angelic systems use to impose it on us, when we're subjugated to it, when it's over us, when we're under law, or these Gentile peoples are under their religious system. What is the mechanism by which this works? And I would say it's exactly the same thing. The angels know what appeals to your and my nature, just like I know what appeals to the nature of the horse, and they dangle that out there, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, right? That these are the things that they can use, visible things, fleshly things. That's what attracts us. That's what allures us. And so would you go to Galatians chapter 4 a moment? Again, remember that back into chapter 3, we had that we are under the law as our schoolmaster, our guardian, our tutor that brings us till the time of Christ. And now in verse 20, once Christ has come, we're no longer under the schoolmaster, so forth. But notice as we go on into chapter 4, we have a new element introduced here. He says the heir of all things, the king's son, as long as he's a child, differs nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all. But he is under tutors and governors. You see how he's using this as an illustration. The king's son may be destined to the throne, but while he's under age, he's set under tutors and governors to train him, to instruct him, until the time appointed of the Father. Okay, Paul, I get that. I'm not exactly growing up in your age, but in your age, everybody would have been aware of that. It doesn't matter if you're the king's son, destined to reign on the throne one day. While you're growing up, when you're a child, you're being placed under these tutors, these governors, and of course they always went to try to find the best ones out there. Who was it they got to be the tutor of Alexander the Great? Oh, it was Aristotle. How would you like to have him as your child's tutor? One of the greatest thinkers in the ancient world. But that's the idea. We want someone to train the child. And when you're dealing with children, you don't start out with abstract concepts, do you? You start out with things that they can touch, that they can feel. If you're dealing with preschool children, that's the best way for them to learn. They've got to see it. They've got to touch it. Hopefully not taste it, but they will. And so that's what Paul is explaining here, that the law treated us as underage children, putting us under this guardianship. And the principles to which we were subjected is explained here in verse 3. Look carefully at verse 3. Galatians 4, verse 3. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. It's extremely important we understand what Paul is talking about here. The term elements is used, it's a Greek word stoicheia. And that word is an interesting word. It sometimes means elementary things, elementary principles, elementary spirits sometimes. It has a variety of meaning. But it's the idea that these are elementary lessons. For instance, it's like your ABCs. To learn how to read or write, you have to memorize your ABCs. That's the stoicheia. That's the elementary principle. To learn how to subtract or add, you have to learn your addition and subtraction tables, right? Y'all remember those days? Can you remember back that far? That's a long time ago, but you remember when you were forced to do those things? How long has it been since you did that? You've outgrown that, right? But when you're at that stage of learning, you're subjected. This is the tool the tutor uses to train you. It's the stoicheia, these elementary principles. And we're going to find this word used twice here in this discussion. That's why it's so important. In other words, this angelic system places you under the stoicheia, the fundamental principles of the earth. But he says in verse 4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. that Christ himself was placed under this Mosaic angelic system. Was he? Was Christ subject to the law? In other words, the law has even another purpose. It's sort of like Messiah training school or Messiah identification school. It's like a test. Whoever can pass this thing, whoever can keep it and keep it perfectly, that's who the Messiah is. And everybody else that's come along like you and me, we just flunked and failed miserably, except this one person who came and kept it perfectly. And what did the law under the Mosaic covenant offer? What was the reward to the one who kept it always, the whole thing? Life. John Riesinger once asked me a question. Where did the life that comes to us through Christ, where do you get that life? How do you earn it? And he pointed out that the law of Moses is the only covenant that offers life for perfect obedience. And that here is the answer. This is the Messiah. He's the only one who has passed the test. And as a result, he has earned life. But what did he do? He laid down that life for you and me. And so Christ himself is made under the law to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Not only did he deliver himself from that subjugation, he delivered you and I from that subjugation. And he has now raised us up, what, to the level of the law or the level of angels? No, far above. Because your Son, he sent forth his Spirit, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no more a servant, but you are a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Now he turns his attention to the Galatians. Here's where the fascinating part comes. I hope you get this. Nevertheless, then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. He's talking about Galatians in their paganism. When you were in this situation, when you didn't know God, didn't know Christ, didn't know the gospel, you were serving, you were bondservants to those who really weren't gods. What's he describing here? These angelic powers that ruled over the Gentile world. You were in bondage to them. But he says now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God, which is a more theological way of putting it, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements? Here it is again, stoicheia, same word he used up there. That the Jew was under the stoicheia that came along with the Mosaic law. These Gentiles were under the stoicheia that came along with their angelic system. But for a little while, these Gentiles have turned to Christ. And again, we got to put a big question mark about the validity of their conversion, because they're being tempted to go back to Judaism. In other words, these pagans have come into the knowledge of Christianity, and Paul is saying you left this beggarly stuff, you went into the Christ who set you free, and now you're turning again. The word again is one of those aha moments. Aha. You're turning again to the stoicheia, putting yourself into bondage to these elementary principles. You see the argument here? You were once, but wait a minute, Paul. Are you actually saying, and he is, that they were once under an angelic system when they were pagans, under stoicheia of that system? They escaped it through the gospel. And now in going into Judaism, they're placing themselves back under the stoicheia. You see his reasoning? The word again is the giveaway. You're turning again to the weak and beggarly elements. You say, well, wait a minute, these guys never were under the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, like Paul was. Of course they weren't. They were pagans. They were under another angelic system. But all they've done is come out of one angelic system. For a little while, they have flirted with the gospel, and now they're placing themselves under another angelic system, the law of Moses. You're just swapping one angelic system for another, one set of stoicheia for another set of stoicheia. You see? This is absolutely mind-boggling. And unless you buy into this worldview that Paul is coming from, you'll never understand it, and you'll never see the importance of it. In the Mosaic law, they placed themselves under bondage to that, or they didn't place themselves, they were born there, right? They didn't ask to be under there, they were just born into it. Paul, born into that system. And it was a system that we have already pointed out dealt with these elementary things. A temple. You say, how in the world could the temple in Jerusalem be an elementary thing? Well, don't take my word for it. Paul, in talking about the tabernacle and later on the temple, says these things are just shadows of heavenly realities. This is not the reality. Yeah, you can touch it, you can go to it, but it's not the real deal. The real deal is the one in the heavens that you can't see. Do you get the picture? This is a type, tupos. It's a shadow. As my hand casts a shadow down here on the floor, you can take a look and you can probably figure out maybe that that's a hand, but you can't tell me whose hand it is just for looking at the shadow. It's just a fuzzy thing, and there is really no substance to the shadow. I mean, let me put my shadow on my scales at home. Tell me how much does that shadow weigh? Well, let's all put our shadows on the scale. How much does it weigh? It's insubstantial. There's nothing really there. And that's the amazing thing about what we're being shown here, is that the things they could see and touch, that physical altar with those physical priests and that physical temple and all of that stuff, that was really nothing. It's a shadow. And it can't do for you what you want it to do. It won't really bring you to God. It's like a model airplane you used to get when I was a little boy. One of the little model airplanes you put together that looks just like the big ones, you know. It's the pattern. It's the model. But it won't get you from here to home. Really? It's made after a pattern of heavenly things, that the reality is not this thing that you can see. It's not a mountain, go back to the woman at the well, that you can go and get on and stand. The mountain that is important is the one in the heavens, Hebrews 12 tells us. The heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly Zion. Christ is not the shadow, he's the substance. Go quickly over to Colossians 2. Colossians 2. There are some interesting things Paul says here along these same lines. In some ways, the book of Colossians is very similar to the book of Ephesians, but it has some elements that are very similar to the book of Galatians. Speaking of Christ's cross work in Colossians 2. Colossians 2, verse 14. We think of what did Christ accomplish on the cross. We think, well, he paid for our sins, and that's certainly true. But Paul is coming at this from a very interesting angle. He says in verse 14, he was blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. What's he talking about? He's talking about the Mosaic Code. He not only fulfilled it, he removed it. He took it out of the way. He fulfilled it not only for himself, he fulfilled it for us, you see. It has no more power over us if we are in Christ. And then, notice the second thing, having spoiled principalities and powers. Where'd that come from? But remember the relationship between angelic powers and the law. To spoil something is to take their captives. What do you think Christ has done to principalities and powers that used to have the authority, that had lost man in subjection to their system? Christ has spoiled them. He's taken the captives captive. He's freed them from angelic rule. He's spoiled principalities and powers and made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. He has defeated, and we sometimes forget this side of the atonement. It's not the heart of the atonement. That's penal substitution, okay? But it's one of the angles of the atonement that is not only a victory over sin, it's a victory over the angels. Christ being put under the angels for a little while, says the book of Hebrews. But he's not under the angels anymore. Where is he? We see him in glory, don't we? And what is he doing? He's taking many sons to glory. Those that were once under the angels, he is now freeing them and taking them to glory in this grand pilgrimage. He's the captain of our salvation, leading a host of sons to glory. So there is this defeat of angelic subjugation that is happening at the cross of Christ. And therefore, the ramification of that is in verse 16, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath, which are a shadow. There it is again. These are simply the shadow of things to come, but the body, the reality, is Christ. Do you understand how fundamental what's going on here? This angelic conflict, angelic subjugation, the employment of stoicheia to illustrate angelic rule. That's how angels rule. And so don't let anyone judge you and put you under the stoicheia again. You've been freed from that. You get the sense, the logic here? You've been redeemed from these elementary principles. Don't put yourself, and you have to do it yourself this time. You might have been born under an angelic system. But this time, if Christ has made you free, if you go back under that angelic system, if you re-embrace the stoicheia, the elementary principles, you're doing it yourself. And notice the next verse. Let no man beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels. Where'd that come from? Notice it's a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels. This time, it's your will. You weren't born. It was not imposed on you. You came out of it, and now you are going back into it of your own free will. You see the contrast? And not holding the head in verse 19, turning loose of Christ, because even as something as innocently seeming as putting circumcision on Gentile believers is in actuality a turning loose of Christ. Because if you can't trust Christ for all, you don't trust him at all. If he's not your all-sufficient Savior, if you have to add something to it, what's saving you is not him, it's that addition that you're adding, circumcision in the case of the Galatian church. So you're turning loose of Christ to go back into the system. And look, let's just keep going here. Verse 20, wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, there's our friend again, stoicheia. If you are dead with Christ from these rudimentary principles, these elementary things that you can touch and see and so forth, that were, holy angels used it to administer the law, pagan angels used it in their system. If you are now dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, they have no more grip on you. He has fulfilled it. He has freed you from it. Why in the world? Why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? Taste not, Touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish with music. Do you see the point? You've been freed from this nonsense. How can you possibly let someone put you back under that system? Angels they're not the ones telling you what to do anymore. Christ is the one telling you what to do. He's your master. He's your focus. It's the word of Christ that is now the important thing in your life. Well, can I close with just really quick application? Number one is the spiritual warfare that we talked briefly last evening, that we need to understand that what's going on here in spiritual warfare. Now, there certainly is demonic activity. I don't deny that in the least. I've seen it with my own eyes. But that's really not what Paul is driving at when he talks about being strong in the Lord and putting on the armor of God and so forth. He's talking about standing firm in the gospel of Christ. You're going to have all of these demonic assaults upon your life. You're going to have what the scriptures call lying spirits, lying signs. We have an example in 1 John 4 of the spirit of Antichrist. How do you recognize? How do you spot the angel again? What's John's answer in 1 John 4? Listen to the message. Listen to what comes out of the mouth of the man. You don't see the angel, but you hear the man, and he that confesses that Jesus is not come in the flesh, that's not the Spirit of God, that's the spirit of Antichrist. This is not the true Jesus revealed to us in the gospel. This is a false Jesus. And so to have a false Christ is an evidence of angelic working behind the scene, fallen angels. I mean, where do these spirits come from? I mean, some of them just come out and tell you. You ask the Mormons, where'd you get your religion? Joseph Smith, where'd you learn this Book of Mormon? Well, the angel Moroni showed up in my bedroom and revealed all these things. I mean, just come right out and say it. Go ask Muhammad. Muhammad, where'd you get this Islamic system? Where'd the Koran come from? Well, I was in this cave and the angel Gabriel came and revealed this stuff to me. I mean, they don't even try to hide it. It's right out there in the open. And you go ask the pagans, where did you get your stuff? The gods came down and revealed it to us. It's all the same thing. And when you begin to see that the system of Moses and pagan systems really at their heart, the same thing. You say, well, how could you say that, Brother Mark? We say, I mean, the Israelites, they got a temple. Well, guess what? There's temples all over the world. They had a mountain that they worshiped on. There's mountains where the holy places are, as in Athens, the Acropolis right there with the temple of the Parthenon, right up on top, the temple of Athena, down at Corinth, the ruins of Corinth. Right next to it is the Acropolis of Corinth. You didn't even know there was an Acropolis down there, did you? Acro-Corinth, they call it, right next to the city. Guess what's up on top of that mountain? It's the temple to Aphrodite, Venus to the Romans, sensual, sexual love. And she had, according to Strabo, the Roman historians, 1,000 prostitutes plying their trade on the streets of Corinth as worshiping of Venus. I mean, wherever you go in the world, you've been to Mexico, you've seen some of those huge pyramids. You see, you got to find a high place. If you don't have a mountain, you got to build your own. You got them right across the river over here in Cahokia. Huge settlement over there. All these big mounds. You know, when the ground's as flat as it is around there, you got to build your own mountain. Same thing down in the Yucatan Peninsula. I went to the temple at Uxmal. You've never heard of that. It's less known. It's huge. And on top, there's this house on top of this huge pyramid, and they call that the House of the Dwarf. I don't know who the dwarf was, but he was the contact for their Mayan gods to communicate through this dwarf on top of that temple. And I'm standing there looking at this, and there's a quadrangle of all these openings into rooms, and the explanation is that the best the archaeologists can figure out, these were chambers where the priests who came to minister at that huge temple, they would live as their living quarters inside one of these rooms. You could go in there and you could see the smoke up on the stone above you where they had been in there cooking. And it dawned on me, that's exactly what you had in Jerusalem. Chambers for the priests. You remember the 24 orders of priests took turns going up and ministering at the temple? They have these chambers for the priests to live in there at the temple in Jerusalem. This is the same thing. Except that's the holy angel system. This is the fallen angel system. I even run into it out west. I was in a museum in Wyoming and found a guy who had sketched a diagram of how the Lakota Sioux, when they came together for their big ceremonies, how they camped, how they knew where to pitch their teepee. Now, most of the time, they're out there hunting the buffalo in these smaller clan groups, but when they come together once or twice a year for their big celebration, for their mojo stuff, their hocus pocus, they come together. And I always thought, well, you just get to where you go. That looks like a good spot. I believe I'll put my teepee right over there. No, that's not what you do. They were assigned a huge circle, and each clan had a location around that circle as to where they were to set up their lodging. At the east end of that circle, there's an opening, and in the middle of the circle, there was one or sometimes two ceremonial tents. Is the light coming on for anybody? You read the book of Numbers, the camp of Israel, circle with the tribes around the four sides, and the tabernacle, the ceremonial tent, right smack dab in the middle. It's the same thing. You say, how do you explain that? Was that just a lucky guess? I mean, it's probably 100 ways of setting up a camp. Did they just happen on the one that God used with Israel? Or are they similar because they're both angelic? I'll let you ruminate on that. And before I close, I have delved into the subject of UFOs since I was back in high school. I remember my senior paper was on UFOs. There wasn't a lot of information out back then, 1966. Couldn't find much written. But I've sort of kept my eye on the subject over the years. And the more I've investigated them, I've run into people. I've never had an encounter, as far as I know, with UFO. But I've talked to people who have. And the more I've looked into it, I've come to the conclusion this sure looks like angelic phenomena to me. And I recently got a hold of a guy in Nebraska named Ray Boucher. Ray is an evangelical Lutheran pastor in a church there in Nebraska. Dear brother, I've really impressed by him. He had a couple of sightings himself when he was a teenager. And then he was head of the MUFON. You're familiar with those initials, the Mutual UFO Network. He was head of that in Nebraska for several years. And somewhere around 1991, he had a meeting. You've heard of the Men in Black? He had two government officials show up, wanting to talk to him. And they had seen some of his writings. Being a pastor, he had written on this, and they had come to meet with him. And what they said was, there's a group of us, it's under wraps, hidden from even from Congress in the government, that we have been tasked with the idea of investigating UFO phenomena. And we are Christians, and we are disturbed about what we are learning and what we're being asked to do. Because what we're being asked to do borders, if not steps over the line, of occultism. In other words, they're saying there's something to this. It's real, but this is not of God. And Ray, in talking to him, what I find delightful is he and I thinking exactly alike. We're saying, yes, we believe that most of these encounters are demonic. And the reason I'm bringing this up, do you realize you had a hearing yesterday in Washington, D.C. on the subject of UFOs? You know that? Something has changed in our government about 2 years ago because they had always covered this up. No, we don't want to talk about this. It's just, this, that, the other. About a couple of years ago, all that changed, and now they're openly having hearings, and they've released the videos of some of the fighter jet. You've seen that perhaps. They're saying, yes, these things are real. There's something to this. And of course, the idea is that, well, these are aliens. They're coming from these extragalactical locations, some star system out here. And the scary part, that if they are so far advanced than us technologically, that they're also advanced from us spiritually. And so they've got the answers. Avi Loeb, chairman of the astronomy department at no less than Harvard University, I was reading his book on the way here. And he says we've got to get ready for contact with these extraterrestrial aliens. We've got to know how to address that, how to prepare the public. And we especially have to get our ducks in order of what questions we want to ask. What do we want to know? And he says for him, the number one question he wants to know is, why are we here? You see, all of a sudden, he's no longer an astronomer asking scientific questions. He's delving into the area of philosophy and metaphysics. That isn't a scientific question. That's a religious question. And these aliens, you see, they're going to be able to tell us. You hear these alien abductions. Talking to Ray Boucher again, he's talked to a number of these so-called abducted people taken on board a UFO, usually given a medical examination and then shown certain things. They have a message, and you know what the message always is that we've come to bring peace, you're going to destroy yourselves. And he says it's almost always coupled with an anti-Christian message. Oh, Jesus, he was just a good man, they say. Or sometimes they say he's over here in another craft. He's one of us. And Ray says it's so fascinating because they never say Buddha. Who would buy that, Or they never say Mohammed. Who would believe that guy? It's always Jesus. Universe. He said, I don't know of a single exception. It's always an attack on Christ. And so you sort of put two and two together. Who is interested in constantly, universally attacking Christ? Yeah. Even the elect. I'm saying something is changing. We are looking at, my eschatology is coming out now. I tend to be in the Amiel camp, and I look at that 1,000-year reign as the church age. I may be right, I may be wrong. But what I do know, and what most of you would agree with, is that we all believe what that text says. At the end of that, Satan is loosed. Right? In other words, there's something coming out here that we've not experienced. And if my spiritual sense tells me anything, what we're seeing in our culture today is a demonic onslaught like we have never seen before in human history. The speed at which it's happened, the intensity at which it's happened. And you say, oh, it's just us here in America in our little corner of the world. My friend, American culture is being sent to the far corners of the earth. I mean, the one good, we don't have many exports anybody wants anymore except our movies, our music, our pornography. That's what we're good at exporting to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is soaking it in. Do you understand? This is a deception that we've never seen the likes of. I said that a couple of weeks to some men in North Carolina. They said, oh, well, but the pendulum may swing back. And I said, yeah, I know that. I know God is able. But I don't think we've ever seen the confluence of all the streams of anti-Christian, anti-Christ assaults that we're seeing today. And what do? We stand firm. We guard the gospel. We recognize where it's coming from. And at the end of the day in this battle, we stand. Having done all to stand, says Paul, that we do not fall prey to these anti-Christian assaults that are coming in spades on our day. May God send revival, but if revival tarries, get ready. As Forrest Gump famously said, that's all I'm going to say about that.